Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the Professor, and this is the Moment of Truth. Before we begin this morning's briefing, I want to announce that it's that time of year again, our holy days, when we celebrate the lives and legacies of our Grand Master teachers. From December through January is when a huge number of our scholastic heroes were born or ascended, everyone from Dr. John Henry Clark to Dr. Ben to Dr. Francis Cress Welsing to Dr. King and others. Today, for instance, is the birthday of Dr. Chancellor Williams. He was one of our greatest, and his seminal work, The Destruction of Black Civilization, is a must-read. You can get it on Amazon, by the way. Most likely you can also get it through your local library, but however you get his works, you need to read it. Knowledge is power, and we must acknowledge and remember those who gave us the game. To win a war, you have to know what you're fighting against and what you're fighting for. And it was our legends like Dr. Chancellor Williams who taught us both. So today, we salute the memory of Dr. Chancellor Williams for inspiring us to follow in his footsteps. Rest in power. Speaking of legacy and putting in work for the next generation, that's pretty much the theme of today's Moment of Truth. It must be Christmas time. Around this time of year, I notice a lot of comments that I get from people who suddenly start wanting me to do a video essay calling out the black baby boomers, or as many of you call them, Generation Fail. I've noticed a lot of comments in the last 10 days or so about that very subject. I don't know if some of y'all didn't get the Xbox or flat screen TV you were hoping for, or if Mama Jessie was rude to you at Thanksgiving dinner or what have you, but something seems to have happened. I guess it's because this is the time of year when a lot of folks are most likely to be in close proximity to these people, and from what I've observed and personally experienced, when you wait for people to change, especially old people, you'll be waiting a long time. So I don't know what to tell you. Obviously, we don't have elders in the black community. All we have are a bunch of old people in our midst. Now, it would be easy for me to bring the olders in for a spanking, but I think we need to connect their behavior to a far larger, far worse malady that's plaguing us. All too often, people try to take refuge inside of delusions and imagination, especially when they're trying to avoid taking accountability for something. The word delusional comes from the root word delude. Now, the word delude comes from the Latin ludere, which means to play. So when somebody says you played yourself, they're basically saying you're deluded. Magical thinking is what people do when they've given up, but they don't want to have to admit they've given up. Now, let me say in advance that this morning's briefing is going to be uncomfortable at some points, but we have to talk about this. We need to discuss things like legacy and inheritance, but do it from a variety of angles because the problem is a lot bigger than just the baby boomers. Brother Tariq talked the other day about plebiscite babble. People who did absolutely nothing to forward reparations, people who were saying reparations would never happen, and that we need to focus on status correction, etc. instead. And that notion is ridiculous on its face, because these white supremacists have never honored a single contract they've signed, never kept their word, or upheld a single agreement that they've entered into. From the Treaty of Versailles to the nuclear non-proliferation treaties to hell, their basic trade agreements, they always get broken. So why does anyone seriously think that the same people who don't keep their word to one another will suddenly discover religion and begin keeping their word to us? The problem is not that we haven't identified ourselves the right way. The problem is we've refused to identify ourselves at all. We've allowed black to simply be a subset of people of color or minority. And in the process, we made it okay to ignore us. On a side note, it's no surprise that the same people who were talking about status correction are also the same people who tried to claim that with the right paperwork, you can receive modest discounts at certain stores, like these big box home improvement stores. I've actually seen videos of people saying that, by the way. Tell me, what sounds more like liberation to you? The people who are telling you to get, fight, and get free, or the people who are telling you how to save a couple of bucks off your next purchase at the Home Depot? Unfortunately, memories are short. A lot of people have forgotten what things were like before the new voices of black media came to prominence. Before we rose to the forefront, there was a whole lot of dumb Negro babble going on, especially in the early aughts. That's what passed for black discourse. The state of our internal dialogue was in the toilet. We had a bunch of half-brained hucksters, 2-bit con men, and professional BS artists who called themselves conducting lectures, quote-unquote. Except all they did was to stand in front of a chalkboard and spout gibberish. These people were imposters, trying to steal the legacy of the real Grandmaster teachers, like Dr. John Henry Clark, Dr. Joseph Ben Yakin, Dr. Francis Cress Welsing, Dr. Chancellor Williams, Dr. Runoko Rashidi, and others. People who apparently were too lazy to read the Bible and didn't have enough integrity to try to be a preacher man hustler, so instead they were spouting New Age, Eastern mysticism mumbo-jumbo. All that nonsense about chakras and kundalini energy and status correction and other knuckle-dragging, mouth-breathing stupidity came out of that group of frauds who were running around 15 to 20 years ago or so. And I don't want to hear anyone saying, "Ooh, Professor Truth, you and you other black empowerment types, y'all are so harsh." Let me tell you something. When a group of people are serious about their power, they don't make it a habit to suffer fools gladly. No other group decides to make excuses for allowing every Tom, Dick, and Harry with a mouth and a dumb opinion to throw in their 2 cents. No other group allows their community to be some sort of ideological big tent. Instead, it's a regimented army. You get in line and you toe the line, and that's the end of it. But not us. We keep making excuses to allow every chucklehead to chime in on the issue, no matter how foolish they clearly may be. We're determined to have some sort of big tent. Well, as I've always taught you, the only thing a big tent is good for is a circus. And for too doggone long, we've been 3 rings, and it's time to shut this show down. Chaos is far easier than order. People with no power have a tough time maintaining order, so there's a lot of openings for the bottom feeders. And in the absence of a counter-movement of real thought leaders, the dregs of our group will start causing problems, and they'll peel off a lot of people simply by virtue of the fact that there's a vacuum. Institutions are what maintains knowledge and traditions. And what is an institution? It's a group of people who have come together in order to preserve and promote a set of ideas or ideals. This is why institutions like religion are so rigid when it comes to their doctrine. They call anyone who doesn't repeat the scriptures exactly as they're written a heretic. But the defense of ideas and ideals only works when you have a group of people who are committed to those ideas and who will not betray them. Now, in order for that to work for the long haul, you have to have a succession of people who are part of that institution. You have to have a group of senior advocates for the institution, but also they have to be cultivating a junior group of advocates as well who will take their place. Why did this not happen for us? Simply put, lack of resources. It takes resources to build an institution and to perpetuate it. When you look at white power's institutions, they have the money to build them, to bring in capable people to administer them, and to have robust recruitment efforts to make sure the institutions remain in existence. New blood is constantly brought in, and these new recruits will remain dedicated to whatever ideals the institution was founded on. When our Grandmaster teachers began to pass away, we didn't have the institutions in place ready to bring to prominence the successors. So in stepped these loud-talking charlatans instead. And since there wasn't any real group of people any place anymore to say otherwise, folks began to gravitate towards these hucksters, and they began believing in fairy tales and legalistic schemes which were blatantly false in their face, but what else could they do? There's a hard reality that we in the grassroots need to understand. Human nature is not constituted in such a way as to allow us to believe in nothing. If you deprive a group of people of knowledge, especially knowledge of their own interest, then rather than choose to believe in nothing, they will believe in anything. So a number of the people you've seen running their mouths are the same people who we had banished to irrelevance years ago, and here they are trying to give themselves a new lease on life. But that's how these imposters live. They try to find whatever parade seems to be the largest, and then they try to jump out in front of it and pretend to be the band major. But how did they come to even have the small followings they managed to get? The truth of the matter is, and here's where we come back to the black baby boomers, a lot of black people of all ages like to engage in magical thinking. People listen to these charlatans for a long time, even though they produce nothing, because these guys weren't taking us anywhere. They weren't talking about reparations or even white supremacy. They were talking about elevating your chakras. The only way you can believe that status correction stuff is if you believe that these white supremacists have some inherent sense of fair play. You're depending on them to keep their word. To you. There's another form of magical thinking closely related to the first. Religion. Now, let me say from the outset, I'm not opposed to people having faith or praying to a deity. Dr. John Henry Clark said it best, we all need a form of spirituality, even if it's not organized religion. And he was right. But what we don't need is for people to allow religion to become a crutch for all the things that we don't want to have to do for ourselves. The biggest problems that's come out of black people's hyper-reliance on religion is the idea of all of one's sins being washed away by some third party who doesn't really require anything from you. That's basically a get out of jail or get out of your responsibility free card, and that's how a lot of folks have been using it. Too many times black people use religion as a way to sanctify and validate their own failings or cowardice. In other words, instead of saying, I meant to do that, they will say, Jesus meant for me to do that. Or they will say, Allah meant for me to do that, or whatever deity you believe in. This malady is particularly bad among the older set, though. There's a reason why the black baby boomers are one of the last groups still regularly found in church. They didn't fight when they were young, and now that they're old, they're just looking for a comfortable place to retire permanently. The same people who were only concerned about getting a job at the plant back in the 60s and 70s, or who thought they could coast off of government programs like welfare, food stamps, etc., are looking at a world where the people they trusted are now targeting them. As I've always told you, there's no substitute for power, and that begins with power over your own life. Only about a handful of black people will be able to farm that one out to their employers, and no black people will be able to farm it out to a government program or some deity in the sky. And trying to hide behind religion is bogus. The day of charismatic miracles is over, okay? All of that burning bush stuff, handwriting on the wall, that was then, this is now. I want you to think about every time that some great thing came into your life, some moment when you said that God was moving, etc. It didn't just fall out of the sky, whatever it was. It was the result of a person that you met or otherwise came into contact with, directly or indirectly. Justice isn't going to come in the form of God opening up the earth and swallowing the bad guys. It comes in the form of people who allow themselves to be the vessels of that change. And to the black baby boomers in particular, I won't say that all of you have been on the BS, but the sad truth is the vast majority are. You don't go from the progress we made in the 60s to everything coming to a dead halt in the mid-70s and beyond without there having been a generational failure. We had a generation who decided to become the black equivalent of Peter Pan. They thought they'd never grow old and were determined to never grow up. And so the hard-fought victories of the silent generation were thrown away by their children. And, lest anyone try to claim that I'm being overly harsh, keep in mind these black baby boomers, they've had the tough questions put to them by their children and grandchildren, that is Generation X and the millennials. And these days we got the Zoomers doing the same thing. Not surprisingly, they couldn't give any answers because it humiliated them to do so. When a baby or a small child is asked a question that they don't want to answer, they give one of three responses. They throw a tantrum, they cry out of helplessness trying to get sympathy, or they just fall completely silent. When a child throws a tantrum, they should be punished. When a child cries to get sympathy, you should give them none. Never do anything for a child just because they cried for it. And if the child suddenly falls silent, you send them to their room. And the same goes for these olders out here. And it happens with all ages, but particularly bad among the black baby boomers. When they throw a tantrum, they lose credibility and are ignored. When they cry to get sympathy or claim you're being hard on them, you tell them stop whining. And if they do the silent treatment thing, then tell them they should never speak ever again. And if they try to, get them a pacifier. You act like a baby, you should be treated as one. I've had many arguments and debates with people, both online and in person, and one of the recurring failings from a lot of people is resorting to magical thinking. That's a slave mentality. During slavery, a lot of black people were reduced to attributing whatever little good came into their lives to the white slave masters because apparently God preferred to distribute his blessings through a racist set. After slavery, for a lot of black people, the blessings came in the form of a white employer, or in the case of most of our single mothers, programs from the white government. Now, when you engage in magical thinking, you're not really trying to engage with the issues facing you. In fact, you're trying to do the opposite. You're trying to dismiss them. The Bible says, be ye doers of the word and not hearers only. But for a lot of black people, they just ignore the first part. The black baby boomers are now finding out too late that what they thought would be their safe place under white supremacy turned out to be the most dangerous place of all. I cannot give any sympathy for that. They made choices. They chose to do nothing as white power gathered its forces against their children. And now they've seen their lives go from sunrise to sunset, and they have nothing to show for it. And while nobody expected the black baby boomers to do everything to topple white supremacy, the sad truth is they're making excuses for the fact that they chose to do nothing at all. And they try to sanctify it by claiming that they did so much for their own children. That's just not true. You know, Dr. Claude Anderson talked about that. The lies and phony talking points that the baby boomers in the black community have used to try to justify betraying their own children. As a group, they chose to leave their heirs with no inheritance. In a world of competition where everyone else will have things made for them as they grow up, or at the very least have things left to them after their parents' deaths, this puts one's children at a distinct disadvantage. And to try to make this betrayal sound pious by claiming they left their children a good mind or good lessons or etc. In other words, they left their children nothing. A good mind won't feed your child or put a roof over their heads, and good lessons won't stop white supremacy from attacking them either. They need resources for that. A child's inheritance is more than just their genes. This is something the black baby boomers don't like to talk about. Part of a child's inheritance is also the physical and material things that are passed down from one generation to the next. You call that legacy. But the black baby boomers don't like hearing about that one at all because it reminds them of their own selfishness. You can teach people about economics till eternity, but the lessons are meaningless unless they have some capital to use to start a business. And the more they have to work with, the more room for error they'll have. That's crucial in a world of hyper-competition. They need every advantage they can get. Whatever happens, they should never be starting from zero. But that only matters if the well-being of the next generation is important to their parents. That's why Sylvester Stallone is raising all that hell about Rocky. When he wrote that movie, he had to sign the rights over to the studio. But the producer of the movie, Irwin Winkler, at some point managed to get the studio to give him the rights to the Rocky franchise. And even Stallone had to admit he had no idea how that could have happened. But it did. Stallone has money. He's been paid millions and millions in acting fees from all the films he's starred in over the decades. And he still gets residuals from all those movies too. So it's not like Sylvester Stallone of all people is hurting for money. But he went ahead and talked about something openly that you don't hear a lot of black folks, especially the black baby boomers, talking about at all. He said the reason that he's so angry with Irwin Winkler and why he doesn't want to have any part to do with Rocky if Irwin Winkler is because of his children's legacy. Stallone said that he wants to ensure that even after he dies, he's still able to take care of his children, and the rights to Rocky happens to be a key part of that. You see, for the people who actually did the work of providing for their heirs, they don't rely on prayers or trusting that their kids will have good minds. Stallone knows that this world runs on material resources, and the fastest way to ensure that any bloodline comes to an end is to deprive the heirs of resources. Remember, that's the most common way that genocides are carried out, through resource deprivation. Our problem as a group is that every generation is forced to start from zero. A large part of that is that we're under constant attack from white power. This is what happened in the decades following the Civil War and Reconstruction. This wicked racist government and the corporate interests that it's fostered work hand in hand to undermine our opportunities and to strip us of whatever we may gain. Now that's a truth. It's the crux of the reason why reparations are required. But the failure of black people resorting to magical thinking to cover up for their shortcomings or refusal to operate in the real world, that's equally to blame. The individuals who are suddenly popping up out of the woodwork, screaming in front of the cameras, they don't surprise me, though I am disgusted. This is part of why we stay on the necks of the roly-polies and the Agent Duvernays and these other bootlicks. We don't want people forgetting what these clowns have done to harm our interests. See, for decades, the white media has had a bunch of professional do-nothing agents like Big Bird and the rest of those clowns over at Cobra. Oh yeah, a bunch of black baby boomers talking about reparations. They were simply there as controlled opposition to calm you and me down and tell us that, oh, I had a luncheon with Nancy Pelosi and we talked about it. It was a good discussion. And I had Kamala Harris in my studio and I asked her about reparations. She said, hell no, and I let it go because we got to get them reelected. That's the kind of advocacy that we've had, which is none whatsoever. And it is important that people know who it was who was doing this. If we don't remind you, then they will stick their heads back up again. And if we don't make an issue out of their treachery, then people will assume that whatever they did must not have been very bad. And the next thing you know, they're standing out in front of some cameras pretending to speak for you and me. We cut the heads off the Hydra, but it also falls to us to make sure that this beast doesn't reconstitute itself again. And I don't care who doesn't want to hear it. If we don't want to repeat our tragic history, then we had better be honest about our past, about how it happened, and who did it. Good day, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors. Lisa Cabrera, Detroit Beauty Supply, Joel Bullen, Darlette Hall, and Brian Walton. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.